The Genvari Galactic Empire had ruled for centuries, expanding its domain with cold efficiency. Its fleets were unmatched, its rulers untouchable, and its influence woven into the very fabric of interstellar society. To the Genvari, dominance was not just a privilege, it was an expectation, a birthright earned through the sheer weight of their technological supremacy. And then there were humans. A latecomer to the galactic stage, the species from Sol 3 had been more of a curiosity than a threat. They had no grand fleets, no ancient war traditions, and certainly no empire. The Genvari saw them as little more than an oddity, a civilization that had somehow stumbled into space and survived by sheer accident. Their penchant for humor, their chaotic culture, and their absurdly diverse ways of waging war had drawn both amusement and condescension from the greater galactic community. Among them, one human in particular had, for a brief time, captured the attention of the universe. His name was John Hudson, though most had long since forgotten that. To those who knew of his exploits, he was something else. He was the Baba Yaga, a ghost, a nightmare whispered in the dark corners of war rooms and bounty hunter hideouts. And yet, like all legends, his story had faded. He had disappeared, his wars fought, his vengeance spent. The Genvari should have let him rest. The announcement had been broadcast on every galactic network, a grand display of superiority. Emperor Rylox the Magnificent, flanked by his ministers, addressed the gathered council of the Empire, his voice dripping with theatrical scorn. "This human," Rylox sneered, letting the word stretch, as though it were an insult in itself. This relic of a primitive war culture once dared to believe he was a force to be reckoned with. But what has he become? A ghost of a lesser age, a forgotten myth clinging to life on some insignificant rock. He chuckled, a sound that rippled through the opulent chamber like the rustling of silk. "I have seen his kind before. They fear war. They grow old, grow soft, and in time they are nothing." The audience, composed of dignitaries, generals, and influential figures from across the empire, murmured in approval. Some laughed outright. Others exchanged knowing glances, as if to say, "Yes, the humans have always been lesser. This one is no different." One of Rylox's advisors, a lanky, reptilian being with golden ceremonial robes, stepped forward with an amused expression. "Perhaps we should extend an invitation, my emperor. Let the great Baba Yaga know we are thinking of him." The chamber erupted in laughter. The message was sent. A transmission beamed across the stars, encrypted but made no secret. The words were sharp, cruel, designed to humiliate. "To the so-called Baba Yaga, the Empire extends its greetings. We have spoken your name in jest and found it lacking. We hear you fear war. We understand, of course. The burden of violence weighs heavy upon lesser creatures. Sleep soundly, relic of a dead legend." And then they went a step further. The assassins were sent, not to kill John Hudson, for that would be too simple. No, they sought a message, a deeper cut, a single strike that would tell the universe exactly what remained of the Baba Yaga. They killed his dog. It was not a quick death, nor was it a clean one. The footage of it was transmitted across the empire, a cruel spectacle designed to break a man who, they believed, had already been broken. When the news reached the quiet colony where John Hudson had taken refuge, the local bar fell into a stunned silence. The hollow screen flickered, replaying the scene in grainy security cam detail. A group of Genvari enforcers, laughing, standing over the motionless form of a cybernetic hound known as Bandit. One of them, a particularly brutish officer, had scrawled something crude onto the side of the dog's plating. "Where is your war now, Baba Yaga?" The glass in John Hudson's hand cracked. The murmurs around him were hesitant, uneasy. The bar was filled with beings of all kinds, human and alien alike. They knew who he was, or rather who he had been. For years, he had been content to live among them as nothing more than another exile, another warrior past his prime. For years, they had assumed he had left that life behind. The bartender, a grizzled old Martian with cybernetic implants and a habit of minding his own business, stepped back. He had seen that look before. The man known as Baba Yaga rose from his seat, placing the broken glass carefully on the counter. He flexed his fingers, testing the old stiffness in his knuckles, then turned to the silent room. Who did it? His voice was calm, too calm. A heavy silence. No one dared to speak, but the answer was already known. Hudson exhaled slowly, then reached into his jacket, pulling out an old earth-made lighter. He turned it in his fingers absently, as if lost in thought. Then, without another word, he stepped out into the night. The first to die were the ones who had done the deed. The Genvari officers, fresh from their victory, had gathered in a private lounge, toasting themselves with imported spirits, recounting the event with sneering bravado. None of them noticed the lights flicker. None of them noticed the security locks disengage. By the time they heard the first muffled sound, a body dropping, a sharp, pained gasp, it was already too late. The doors slid open with a whisper of hydraulics, revealing a figure standing in the threshold. John Hudson. He was unarmed. It didn't matter. The fight was short, brutal. The first Genvari lunged at him, reaching for a weapon. Hudson was faster. His hand shot out, grabbing the alien's wrist in a vice grip, twisting it with a sickening crack. He turned, using the body as a shield, twisting the enforcer's own gun out of its holster and pressing it against his temple. A single shot. The second enforcer scrambled backward, fumbling for a weapon. Hudson moved before he could, crossing the room in 2 swift strides, his boot connecting with the alien's chest, sending him sprawling. By the time the third tried to run, Hudson had already reached him. A single precise strike, a heavy, deliberate impact to the throat, sent the enforcer choking to the ground. And then silence. Hudson stood amid the wreckage, his breathing even, his gaze distant. The bodies lay around him, a grim tableau of efficiency. He had not acted out of rage, not out of grief. It had been something colder, more precise. He turned his head slightly, noticing a security camera blinking in the corner of the room. He stepped forward, leaned down to the lens, and spoke. "You wanted to know where my war is?" He wiped the blood from his hands, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off rust. "I'll show you." And just like that, Baba Yaga returned. The Genvari Empire did not realize the scale of their mistake until it was too late. The first warning came in the form of silence. It was subtle at first, minor disruptions in communication networks, slight anomalies in their security grids. Then, entire outposts went dark without explanation, not through orbital bombardment or large-scale warfare, but with eerie precision. A station that had once been bustling with activity was now nothing but a ghostly, abandoned husk, its personnel unaccounted for. At first, the Empire's intelligence officers dismissed these events as isolated incidents, mere coincidences in the vastness of space. But then the pattern became undeniable. John Hudson had begun his war. On a remote listening post along the Empire's outer rim, Lieutenant Voss of the Genvari sat in the dim glow of his terminal, reviewing security footage with increasing frustration. The feeds kept cutting out, static blooming across the screens at irregular intervals. He tapped at the controls, trying to reroute power, but the system refused to comply. A deep sense of unease settled in his chest. The Genvari were not accustomed to fear. Their empire had stood for thousands of years, unchallenged, unshaken. But something about this was different. The nature of the attacks, the precision, the quiet unraveling of their systems. It did not follow the patterns of traditional warfare. It felt personal. A distorted voice crackled through the comms. At first, it was nothing but static, a garbled mess of sound. Then, words took shape, human words. Knock, knock. The lights in the station flickered. The main doors, built to withstand heavy artillery, groaned as if under pressure. Then they burst open. Voss barely had time to react before the darkness beyond the entrance swallowed his men. The corridor filled with the sounds of a brief, efficient struggle, bodies hitting the floor, the hiss of suppressed weapons, the sharp crunch of breaking bones. Then silence. Voss reached for his weapon, his fingers tightening around the grip just as a figure stepped through the doorway. John Hudson. The man moved like a shadow, a ghost made flesh. He wore a combat suit stripped of any identifying insignia, a blend of old Earth military tech and scavenged alien components. In his hand, he held a Genvari pulse rifle, one of theirs, turned against them. His gaze was cold, measured. Voss had never feared death before. Now, he wasn't sure he would be granted the mercy of it. Hudson strode forward with the confidence of a predator that already knew the outcome of the hunt. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at the lieutenant, as if deciding whether the man was worth the time it would take to kill him. Then, he knelt down, reaching for the station's main terminal. With a few swift movements, he inserted a small, nondescript device into the system. A virus. Instantly, red warnings flashed across the screens, alerting the entire Genvari security network that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Hudson finally spoke, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I want you to tell your emperor something." Voss swallowed hard. "What?" Hudson leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "I'm coming." And then he was gone. By the time reinforcements arrived, the station was a graveyard. The virus Hudson had installed spread like wildfire, infiltrating the Empire's vast network before anyone could contain it. Within hours, key military installations were thrown into disarray. Supply routes were misdirected. Security clearances were wiped. Entire fleets found themselves cut off from command. The Genvari had built their empire on control, on the belief that their superior systems would always grant them the advantage. They had never accounted for someone like John Hudson. Back on the Empire's capital world, Emperor Rylox seethed as he reviewed the reports. "This is unacceptable," he growled, his hands tightening into fists. His advisors stood in silence, unwilling to meet his gaze. "A single human is dismantling our infrastructure, and you expect me to believe there is nothing we can do?" One of his generals, a towering brute covered in ceremonial armor, cleared his throat hesitantly. "Your Majesty, this human, he does not fight like an army. He does not take planets, does not hold territory. He is a phantom. He strikes and vanishes." Rylox's eyes burned with fury. "Then find him and kill him." The general hesitated. "That may prove difficult." Rylox turned sharply. "Explain." The general hesitated only for a moment before bringing up a holographic display. It showed a warship, one of their own, drifting in the wreckage of what had once been a fleet convoy. "This was our latest attempt to capture him," the general admitted. Rylox narrowed his eyes. "What happened?" The general took a breath before responding. "He boarded the vessel alone." The room fell silent. Rylox stared at the man as if he had lost his mind. "You expect me to believe that one human took an entire warship by himself?" The general nodded grimly. "Yes." Rylox's mind raced. This was impossible. And yet, the evidence was irrefutable. The footage showed everything. Hudson moving through the ship's corridors like death incarnate, dismantling squads of elite Genvari soldiers with ruthless efficiency. He did not waste time. He did not toy with his enemies. He killed with the cold, detached precision of a man who had done this before many times. Rylox felt something then, something he had not felt in years. Doubt. For the first time in his reign, he questioned the supremacy of the Empire. "Where is he now?" he demanded. The general hesitated before responding. "We don't know." Rylox slammed his fist against the arm of his throne, his voice rising in anger. "Then find him." But even as he spoke the words, he knew it was too late. John Hudson was already in motion. The Empire's mistake had not been underestimating him. Their mistake had been provoking him. And now they were at war. The Galactic Empire moved quickly, but John Hudson moved faster. Across the Empire, the Genvari High Command scrambled to make sense of what was happening. Their fleets were being crippled, their outposts left gutted and abandoned, their soldiers hunted like prey. It was as if Hudson was everywhere and nowhere at once. He did not engage in grand battles. He did not wage war in the conventional sense. Instead, he dismantled their war machine with terrifying precision. One by one, key installations fell silent. The Genvari's tactical AI, an entity so advanced it had once predicted the outcome of entire planetary conflicts with near-perfect accuracy, struggled to make sense of the pattern. There was no order to his attacks, no predictable sequence. He struck at vital supply chains one moment and then cut off communications between their generals the next. He stole ships, then left them abandoned, booby-trapped with explosive surprises for whoever came to reclaim them. Most terrifying of all was the effect he had on morale. Fear spread like wildfire. Rumors whispered through the ranks. Stories of entire battalions wiped out in the dead of night. Of ships whose life support systems mysteriously failed after Hudson had supposedly infiltrated them. It didn't matter if the stories were exaggerated. What mattered was that the Empire's soldiers believed them. And belief was a powerful weapon. On the bridge of the Genvari dreadnought Imperium's Wrath, Grand Admiral Vorik stood rigid, hands clasped behind his back, watching the flickering star map before him. His face, a hardened sculpture of war-worn resolve, remained unreadable as the latest reports streamed in. Another ship lost. Another outpost gone dark. The unthinkable had happened. A single human was bringing the greatest empire in the known galaxy to its knees. A comms officer hesitated before speaking. "Sir, we've received another message." Vorik exhaled slowly. He already knew what it was. "Play it." The bridge's central display changed. The image that appeared was grainy, as if pulled from 1,000 different intercepted transmissions. The silhouette of a man sat in what appeared to be the command chair of a Genvari battleship. His face was shadowed, his posture relaxed, almost lazy. A glass of something amber-colored was held in his hand, raised slightly in mock salute. "John Hudson." "Hello, boys," he said, his voice carrying a casual amusement that only made the threat behind it more unnerving. "I hope you're enjoying the show." The bridge was silent. Hudson leaned forward slightly, his eyes cold despite the humor in his voice. "I told you I was coming. I gave you a chance. But you didn't listen." He swirled the drink in his glass. "You know, I gotta say, I'm kind of disappointed. I expected more from the so-called mightiest empire in the galaxy. Instead, what do I find? An overgrown bureaucracy held together by a bunch of scared little tyrants who have no idea what to do when the tables turn." He took a slow sip of his drink. "But don't worry," he continued, setting the glass down. "I'm going to help you figure it out." The image flickered. A new display popped up beside it. A live feed from the Genvari's main military supply hub. A massive orbital station responsible for distributing fuel and weapons to their fleets. The station exploded. Fire and debris scattered across the void, sending shockwaves rippling through nearby space. On the bridge of the Imperium's Wrath, the officers could do nothing but watch in stunned horror. The image of Hudson returned, a smirk touching the corner of his lips. "See you soon." The transmission cut out. Vorik clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of every officer's gaze on him. No one spoke. No one dared. Because they all knew. The Baba Yaga wasn't just a myth. He was a reckoning. Emperor Rylox's patience had reached its breaking point. The once unshakable ruler of the Genvari Empire sat in his private war chamber, surrounded by his most trusted strategists. His golden robes, once immaculate, were now slightly disheveled, as if the very act of existing in this new reality had unsettled him. "This cannot continue," he said, his voice tight with rage. One of his ministers, a shriveled, calculating creature named Palvek, nodded. "The people are afraid, my emperor. The military is losing faith. Our control is slipping." Rylox's fingers tapped against the polished armrest of his throne. "Then we must make a statement. A statement. The empire was built on dominance, on power, on the undeniable knowledge that none could challenge them and live. This human, this relic of some forgotten war, was rewriting that narrative. That could not be allowed. We will draw him out," Rylox decided, his voice sharpening. "We will give him a target too important to ignore." Palvek's gaze flickered with understanding. "A trap. A spectacle," Rylox corrected. "Something grand. Something final." The plan was set. Across the empire, a broadcast went out, an announcement from the emperor himself. To the one who calls himself the Baba Yaga, Rylox's voice boomed through every major channel. You have played your games long enough. I grow weary of your cowardice, of your petty sabotage. He leaned forward, his golden eyes gleaming. You wish to strike at me? Then do it. The display shifted, showing a grand palace, Rylox's own citadel on the Empire's capital world. I will be waiting. It was a challenge, a lure, a declaration that Hudson's war would end where it had begun, with the Emperor himself. The Empire braced for the worst. John Hudson simply smiled. In the shadows of a distant system, aboard a stolen Genvari warship, he watched the transmission in silence. He had expected something like this. It was the last play of a desperate man. His fingers traced the edge of a combat knife resting on the table beside him. He wasn't walking into a trap. He was setting one. The Genvari had built their empire on the belief that they were untouchable, that their might was unquestionable, that no single being could ever bring them down. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Hudson stood, rolling his shoulders, shaking off the stiffness that came from too many quiet moments between the storm. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about proving something. A lesson written in blood and fire. The Baba Yaga was coming. And this time, he wasn't leaving survivors. The capital of the Genvari Empire, Vortha Prime, had never known war. It had never been touched by invasion, never felt the sting of an enemy's blade. For centuries, it had stood as a symbol of absolute control, a world so deeply fortified that the very idea of an outsider setting foot upon it was laughable. And yet, in the dead of night, the alarms began to scream. John Hudson moved like a shadow through the imperial citadel. The once impenetrable fortress was in chaos. His virus had stripped away its security, leaving entire corridors blind, communications scrambled, and automated defenses useless. He did not arrive with an army. He did not need one. He was the war. A squad of Genvari royal guards patrolled the upper halls, their heavy boots echoing through the marble corridors. They had trained for countless scenarios, fought wars on distant planets, and stood against entire battalions. None of that prepared them for him. Hudson struck from the darkness, moving between them with brutal efficiency. A knife found the throat of the first guard before he even realized what was happening. The second turned, weapon raised, but Hudson caught his arm, twisted, and fired the alien's own rifle into his squadmates. A third lunged. Hudson dodged, swept the legs, and drove a combat boot into his skull. By the time the last one fell, Hudson didn't even bother looking back. His eyes were locked ahead. The throne room. It loomed at the end of a long, regal hallway, its gilded doors reinforced with layers of energy shielding. It was a place built for rulers, not warriors, a place where power was meant to be displayed, never questioned. Hudson didn't slow his stride. The guard stationed at the entrance opened fire the moment they saw him, but Hudson was already moving. He dove forward, rolling beneath the first volley, then came up firing. Genvari bodies hit the floor in rapid succession. He advanced, reloading fluidly, never hesitating. One guard, desperate, lunged with a blade. Hudson sidestepped, caught his wrist, and drove his own knife into the alien's chest. As the last body fell, Hudson turned to the grand doors. From his belt, he pulled a small human-made explosive, a device so primitive by Genvari standards that their sensors didn't even recognize it as a threat. That was their mistake. He pressed it against the door, stepped back, and watched as it detonated with a deafening roar. The throne room lay open before him. Emperor Rylox stood at the far end, bathed in the glow of his opulent surroundings. His golden robes shimmered in the firelight, his expression unreadable as he regarded the man who had shattered his empire. Around him, his personal guard, elite warriors chosen from birth, stood ready. Hudson exhaled. "I expected you to run," he said, stepping forward. Rylox tilted his head, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. "And leave my throne to a primitive?" He spread his arms slightly. "No. If I am to die, it will be with dignity." Hudson didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon. The first guards rushed him. They were fast, faster than any soldier he had fought before. They moved with inhuman precision, their weapons and bodies enhanced by the finest Genvari technology. Hudson didn't care. He fought with brutal simplicity, no wasted movement, no hesitation. He fired in tight bursts, each shot lethal. He weaved between strikes, countered with deadly force. A blade scraped his armor, leaving a shallow gash across his side. Hudson ignored it. Pain was an old friend. He caught one guard's wrist, twisted until bones snapped, stole his weapon mid-motion, and used it to cut down two more. Another charged, plasma blade swinging. Hudson ducked, drove an elbow into the alien's throat, then shot him in the head without looking. The last guard hesitated. That was his mistake. Hudson grabbed him by the collar, spun him, and threw him into the Emperor's throne with a sickening crack. Silence. Rylox's fingers twitched slightly. His gaze flickered to the bodies of his finest warriors, then back to Hudson. For the first time, the Emperor of the Genvari looked afraid. Hudson stepped forward. Rylox lunged. He was fast, faster than any Genvari Hudson had ever fought. Enhanced by cybernetics, honed by centuries of rule. His strike was meant to be lethal. Hudson caught it. Rylox's eyes widened as the human gripped his wrist like iron. "You should have stayed silent," Hudson murmured. Then he drove his fist into the Emperor's gut. Rylox staggered, gasping, his robes now stained with blood. Hudson grabbed him by the throat, slammed him against the ruined throne, and held him there. Outside, the sounds of battle filled the city. The Empire was falling. Hudson's war had spread beyond him. Aliens once ruled under Rylox's iron grip had risen up, emboldened by the destruction of their oppressor's fleet. The people had joined the fight. Hudson wasn't here to rule them. He was here to finish it. He pulled Rylox forward, dragging him through the shattered doors, through the grand halls where once the Emperor had walked untouched. The sounds of the fight outside died as Hudson stepped onto the palace balcony, his hand wrapped around the fallen ruler's throat. The streets below were filled with thousands. Fighters, civilians, rebels, those who had lived under Genvari rule their entire lives. They stared in silence. Then Hudson threw Rylox down the steps. The Emperor rolled, tumbled, landed in a heap at the foot of his own palace. A ruler dragged through the streets like a broken relic of a dying empire. Hudson stood over him. The people watched, waiting. Rylox tried to rise, coughing, spitting blood onto the stone. His golden robes were torn, stained, useless. His empire was gone. Hudson aimed his weapon. Rylox looked up, breathing hard, fear and fury battling in his gaze. "You think this makes you a king?" he rasped. Hudson shook his head. "No." Then he pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the city. The people watched as the Emperor's body slumped, his reign ending not in a grand declaration, not in war, but with a single merciless bullet. Silence held for a moment. Then the city erupted. The people, aliens, exiles, survivors, roared as the weight of tyranny shattered. They cheered, not for Hudson, but for what had been done. For the first time in centuries, the Genvari Empire had fallen. Hudson turned away, leaving the body where it lay. He did not raise his hands in victory. He did not stay to rule. He walked away. The war was over. The legend of the Baba Yaga was just beginning,